that. Well, again, thank you for coming. Some of you may have seen my 2002 exhibit at the Cayuga Museum, based on the entire history of what I was able to mount in that back big room. Part of that same exhibit is presently at the Cayuga Owasco Lakes Historical Society in Moravia. They have the only, really only existing President Millard Fillmore's memorabilia. Other presidents have their own buildings, libraries, and so on. Fillmore only has that very large room in the History House in Moravia. So part of my exhibit, because Moravia became the Mecca of spiritualism back at the time, and it was, of course, Mary Todd Lincoln coming to Moravia that really made it the Mecca of spiritualism. I want to talk about Abraham Lincoln in a moment, but because it was in the White House that they did have a seance room. And of course, it was always spoken at the time that it was really Mary Andrews who was in spiritualism. But there was a seance room, and at some point, I do have a copy, the only copy, I covered it up, and maybe Jackie at some point. It's a rare book. And, well, we'll wait till the end. I'm sorry, Jackie. But anyway, there was only one book that was ever written of a biography of Abraham Lincoln. And it was a man who knew Lincoln, and it was in one of those volumes, on 3 pages, is the wording that the biographer wrote as a quote from his own knowledge. Well, he was a very close friend of Lincoln, who said he was a believer of spirit world. So, because it was always assumed it was just Mary Todd Lincoln, who came to Auburn. And I want to tell you how we found the proof of that, or I should say Richard Palmer. And some of you know his name because he's written several books on the history as it relates to Cayuga County. He just did one recently on the stone buildings in Cayuga County with pictures of some of the beautiful houses in Cayuga County. And he just did one on the ships that went down in Lake Ontario. So he's a well-known historian, and I met him back in the early 1970s when he was a reporter for the Syracuse Herald. And of course, when he found out I was doing the research, and from the day he found out and forevermore, when he'd see me on the street, both arms would go up in the air and he'd go, woo, woo! And so it was even at a city council meeting, which I was always on time if I wanted to be there. And I came in late that evening and he saw me across the room. And of course, woo's here. So anyway, I share that with him. I may skip around a little bit because that's how my mind functions, but I'll try to stay on my script. The definition of spiritualism in Webster's dictionary is the belief that the dead survive as spirits which can communicate with the living, especially with the help of a third party, called a medium. And of course, over the centuries, death has drawn great scrutiny and a distinct turning away. But it is really in Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on Death and Dying in 1969, where she marked the beginning of the end of the age of denial about what happens to us when we die. And I want to read her quote. At the moment of transition, you're never ever alone. You're never alone now, but you don't know it. But at the time of your transition, your guides, your guardian angels, people whom have loved you and who have passed on before you, they will be there to help you in your transition. We have verified this beyond any shadow of a doubt, and I say this as a scientist. And most of the time, it is a mother, or a father, or a grandparent, or a child, if you've lost a child. It is sometimes people that you didn't even know were on the other side already. And of course, people in hospice are aware of this. Now, with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's materials, some of which were included in the exhibit, but it was Dr. Edgar Mitchell. Some of you know that he was an astronaut back in the early 1970s when he came as a speaker at the Cayuga Community College. He met with a group of us. He was of course, as I've indicated, as an astronaut, but he had a paranormal experience in space. And as a result of it, as he told us then, but now, some years later, because this was in the early 1970s, he started an organization called Noetic Sciences, NOS. He founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1971. The investigation of mediumship became one of many areas of focus for the Institute. So if you go on the internet and look up NOLS, or Institute of Noetic Sciences, you'll see the hundreds of scientists that have been involved in kind of the paranormal. And they're, of course, not only scientists, researchers, but among what they did was they published a book on the subject, and a new name has been given to spiritualism. It's called channeling, which is also, thus the stamp, of course, of approval, which is what he said, given to it and communication with the other side recognized as possible. Some of you may, some years ago, when I did a number of feature articles, may recall I did a big article because I was doing volunteer work in the prison. But I got to talk to some of the inmates who shared stories of the ghosts of the big house. And some of you may remember it. But I brought it only just to say, little by little, I've had a little attention about bringing to the attention of what public may want to know. The important thing about where we are sitting right now, though, and I'm going to go to that because I think it's important that some of you be aware that, and some of you may be aware, that around the earth, and if you go on the internet and look up ley lines, L-A-Y, lines, you'll see a map of the earth with lines that go around in different directions. And 3 scientists from the University of Pennsylvania, doctors in senior moment. Well, after all, I am 90, so I could have a senior moment. But anyway, they were able to study and I'll call it vibrations, from emanating from around these lines. And they were able to measure them in a scientific way. And what they realized is that this is, even though we've known about these lines, but now they know that this is how whales and birds, etc., know how to migrate. They follow those ley lines. Okay? And so there's much to be said about ley lines. And of course, one of the reasons that makes ley lines even more interesting, even here, but is because, as you know, rivers flow south. Will you all agree? I see some heads shaking. The Nile flows north. The rivers out of the Finger Lakes flow north. Right? They're on ley lines. And then we have a lot of migration of birds coming up along the Finger Lakes, and that's exactly why. There are ley lines. Some of you may know, and I want to go back to the ley lines, because, and I'm going to have, Carol. Now I'm going to ask you to pass these around because I only have so many copies. But I want you to see where the ley lines go around the United States. And you'll notice that there's some that actually intersect. And pass them around after you've had a chance to look at, because they differ a little bit. But as you look at the lines, you're going to see that there are only 4 places in the United States where more than 3 cross. Okay? I'll wait till some of you have had a chance. But you're going to see that Sonoma, Arizona is a major place. Well, where do people go for healing? Right? All right. Look where the Mormon church is on a cluster.
Yeah.
Notice off the coast of California, the Bermuda Triangle. You see it? Have all of you had a chance to take a look at any of these maps? All right, pass them around, just want you to see. But I want you to also pay attention that there's also a cluster of light lines, and there's only 4 big clusters. Auburn, New York. The mounds that were built prior to the time of the Algonquin Indians were man-made. And there are mounds. There's an Indian mound cemetery down in Moravia.
Yep.
Okay, one of those ley lines that goes around the earth through Fort Hill Cemetery goes to that mound. Okay? But the mound that goes parallel across New York State is where all of the various Indian settlements, right? The Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, I know I'm going to give. But anyway, they're all on that ley line. And the Native Americans throughout early history that we know of, they never settled except they put a settlement on a ley line where it intersected. There's a certain amount of energy. There's a lot of healing that's attributed to it. And I could talk for an hour on ley lines. But I wanted you to know that the one that goes through the Bermuda Triangle has about 8. But we have 6 and maybe 8. But anyway, that I thought would be of interest. By the way, there's one that goes right through Auburn Prison, north, and that's why those guys were seeing things at Auburn Prison. All right? So, and even as a child, and by the way, important to tell you, that when babies are born, and some of you may know this if you're nurses, and some of you may also know that brainwave activity, when a baby is born, it's born down in delta. It's born down, but it moves up into theta, right? And then as a child until you reach the age of, some people call it reasoning, 10, 11, 12, they're always in alpha, right? That's why they can imagine things and play and so on, right? But you and I, if we were hooked up to a brainwave activity, are in beta. If I hypnotize you, I gotta get you down in alpha. And if I get you down in theta, like 3 doctors did during the Korean War, when we were surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir. I know because my first husband was in the 1st Marine Division that landed at Incheon. And they were surrounded around the Chosin Reservoir. And the Chinese had surrounded all of the United Nations troops that were there from various countries. The 3 medical doctors were in the MASH unit, and they had run out of anesthesia. And 2 of the injured soldiers needed serious surgery, and they were told they were out of anesthesia. But they knew how to hypnotize, and they could either strap the men down or hypnotize them. And they said, we'll let you hypnotize. As a result of that, the American Medical Association accepted hypnosis into the American Medical Association. I tell you this because I think it's more current that we know some of these things, because there's so much more that we are now even learning. Some of you may be aware of Chinese acupuncture, where you see a chart with all of these lines that go through the body. Yep. Well, where they intersect is where that needle is placed. Well, I worked with a doctor, Dr. Peter Guy Manners, and if you look up the word cymatics, C-Y-M-A-T-I-C-S, he and a group of doctors, and this man was not only into electronics, an electrical engineer, he was a medical doctor. But they were able to measure the frequency that comes out from between where they cross these the lines, and I want to call them meridian lines and so on, but anyway. And as a result of it, they know that they can give the correct frequency and emit health and maybe healing on that. It's really the nervous system. It's our electrical system, and some people call it that. But we know that that's coming. And I studied in California. And because that's a lot more of where more of the paranormal work is being done. It's just that it's great to know that we're always moving forward on how to heal. But I want to get back to spiritualism. The Fox sisters, who some of you may know, were known back in the period of the 1800s. They were young girls, and the parents had moved into a house, and the children were hearing knocking. And they began to communicate, and this knocking would answer. And so they'd ask things like, are you a man or a woman? And if it was one knock, it was yes, and then two knocks, it was no, etc. And so they convinced the parents to listen. Well, then the neighbors started to come over, and they became very popular. Well, there was no way to prove after they dug up the cellar, because there was no skeleton that was found, right? But, gotta go to page 2, because I want to get the date right. There was an article, a copy of that page was in my exhibit. There was an article in the Boston Journal on November 23rd, 1904. It read as follows. Rochester, New York, November 22nd, 1904. The skeleton of the man supposed to have caused the rappings, first heard by the Fox sisters in 1848, has been found in the walls of the house occupied by the sisters, and clears them from the only shadow of doubt held concerning their sincerity in the discovery of spirit communication. Found was an almost entire human skeleton between the earth and crumbling cellar walls, and corroborates the sworn statement made by Margaret Fox, April 11, 1848, because they dug up the cellar. Well, those were the girls that came to Auburn, and they actually were guests of some of Auburn's elites. The head of the hospital, the chief of police, and some prominent citizens. The only house still remaining of the 5 houses that they had, circles they called them then, is the one house up on North Street that has the pillars. One of the houses is where the YMCA stands. Another house was where they tore down and put the county office building, which they may tear down again. But anyway, that's another. Okay. So they were held over a period of 3 years. When I went to, but also in my research, I found out that it was William Seward. I'm sorry, back up. That's another story for another day. But in doing my research, I discovered that I want to get this correct. I have a cheat here. Okay. Of the city, of the homes that the houses were held in, as I said, the only one still remaining. But when I was doing the research up in Moravia, where Mary Todd Lincoln did stay overnight, because she heard about Mary Andrews from President Fillmore, who was president, as you know, after President Lincoln. Well, she, of course, believed in spiritualism, and he told her there was a reputable spiritualist. And the reason he knew that she was reputable, he was hearing from people like William Smith, who built the Smith Opera House. In 1972, when I went over there to start the restoration of the Smith Opera House, I didn't know that, but the day I first met the editor of the the Geneva newspaper that I wanted to give an article to and have an ad, that I wanted to do an event to start fundraising to save the Opera House. And so when I told the editor that it was going to be a psychic fair, he said, I don't care if you give me a paid ad, and I'm not even going to allow an article. Well, as God is my witness, I left and I walked up to the Historical Society in Geneva because I wanted to see, because I understood there were several boxes of memorabilia from the Smith Opera House, which opened in 1982. James O'Neill, the father of Eugene O'Neill, was the opening act at the Smith Opera House with the Count of Monte Cristo. Right. And so a number of prominent people performed on that stage. Well, so I looked at several boxes that were in the room, and I said, well, I'll start with this one. And I pulled it over, and I started, there were several boxes. And so I'm starting with the first box, and I'm beginning to cull through. And there's a paper at the back of the box moving up of its own volition. And I reached and I pulled it out. And I began to read it. And it said, William Smith was a believer of spiritualism. Well, it had a very credible letterhead, and it had an original signature. And I asked the historian to make a copy and certify that it had come from one of the boxes in her building. I then left and I went down to the Finger Lakes Times, and I got to see the editor, and I handed him to the paper, and he looked at it, and he said, well, I guess you'll have your ad and your article. Yeah. So anyway, I really encourage you, if you haven't been down to Moravia, to see the Fillmore exhibit. If that building burns down, that's the only thing of Millard Fillmore. Yes, he did build a house for his wife outside of Buffalo, but this is some of his memorabilia. And it's fortunate that we have some things, because the room is just dedicated, it's 2 rooms, that's dedicated to William, Millard Fillmore. So he did tell, of course, Mary Todd Lincoln, she came to Auburn. And so for years, as I told you, Richard Palmer would see me and, okay. Well, one night, because I used to do art renderings for his articles over the years, and so one night he calls me late at night, and he never calls after 8 p.m. So he said, Joyce, I'm standing in front of the old desk where you register coming into the old hotel, and I'm looking at the register. Now, some of you that have been around Auburn know that there was a big building next to Angelo's, which now is a parking lot, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's where the old National Hotel was. I remember it because it was there when I was a kid. But anyway, he said, you're not going to guess whose name's in the register. Mary Todd Lincoln. So, you were right. Well, anyway, she did come to Auburn. She took the train to Moravia. By the way, there were 6 trains a day at that time because spiritualism was very big after the Civil War. And so she went down, spent the night with Mary Andrews. Okay, back to my notes. Spiritualism, of course, its growth really was attributed to the Civil War. By the way, one of those ley lines goes right through the Cayuga Museum. By the way, I learned how to dowse, and I did act, and I don't mean just with it, but typically I've actually taught children BOCES how to dowse. And what we used, even though I showed them with the apple, but we use a welding rod, which we cut off, I think it's 6 inches, and bend it so that they can hold it. And when they hold the tube, when they hold it over a bucket of water, it crosses. It crosses, And the demonstration, they loved to do it because they'd all take turns and they did it over the bucket of water. And I know we had a Pioneer Days down in Moravia, and so there were a couple of Girl Scouts there that had seen that I had, but they knew about the dowsing. And so we actually had a number of exhibits from the Pioneer Days that day down there at the History House. But we had a pail of water, and the kids were showing their parents about dowsing. So, yes, I've actually done a little bit of dowsing, but you have some good dowsers in the area. And you know what? A lot of farmers know about how to do this, so this isn't new, really. Yes, there you go. Yeah. Well, the largest spring fed, I'm going to go back to hearing 2 professors at Cornell University back in the early 70s, and they said that prior to the time of Columbus, the Native Americans came to this area from Newfoundland. What is Newfoundland? The Carolinas. They came up, and from Ohio. Why? Because there was a severe drought that lasted for over 20 years. And why did they come here? These are the largest spring-fed lakes in the world. Not in the United States, in the world. We are so fortunate. Because I've lived in many places. My husband was in the military. New Orleans, Washington, D.C., California. And there's a lot of places in the United States I was not going to drink the water. But if you have a filter and take the chlorine out, you got better water than what you're paying money for bottled water. And I am very serious, because I worked with a chemist, and I know there's truth to it. You got the best water. And then one reason I moved back here from California. But then again, so Mary Todd Lincoln did visit, so it did spread like wildfire that she'd been here. And needless to say, many, many people started to come. There are a number of prominent people. The head of the New York State legislature, and I have his name, and it's tucked if you really want to know. Wait a minute, I think I've got it. Anybody who's into New York State history. But there was a prominent New York State legislator, Judge John W. Edmonds. And he then wrote 2 books on it, very good books, very well-written books, and they're really rare to find. He was a member of both branches of the New York State legislature, and for some time a president of the Senate and judge of the Supreme Court of New York. So he was quite prominent. And of course, some of you may know that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a believer. In fact, he wrote a book called The Fairies, besides, his other book that we all know about. But he was a believer, and that book has some interesting pictures of little people. Okay. Yeah, it was Henry C. Whitney, whose book I have. The presidents believed in spirit world. Quote, he communed often with invisible spirits and talked with a person of God because he was a mystic. Really, it was Mary Todd Lincoln coming that made Moravia very famous. It turned out there were like 30 mediums within a matter of just months. We came up to the area. When she was in Auburn, she saw Dr. Hotaling, Hotaling. He was and back then there were, it wasn't medical doctors, it was the physicians that were the ones that were using healing with herbs and so on, that were the way doctors were then. And that's coming back with a vengeance, and I mean that in a very good way, because we're now able, because of chemistry and so on, that many of the plants that were supposed to have done things then do things the same now. So a lot of the natural healing, without paying expensive monies for pharmaceutical drugs, we've got them the way to heal in natural ways. And I won't go there. But I do believe it, because I've seen some examples. And I myself had training in naturopathy and homeopathy. But it's very big out in California, which 20 years after chiropractic was being done in California, New York finally allowed it to come here. I was also an insurance broker and a real estate broker. And I can tell you, the insurance company in New York State is the biggest insurance company, and they've kept a lot of things, including chiropractic, from coming here. We better leave that subject alone. Okay. Okay, 8 trains a day from Auburn to Moravia back at the time. That's how big it got to be. There were a number of prominent physicians and scientists back at the time who began to look at things that were paranormal. So, but it's only been really in more recent times, because we have the ability to measure whether it's electronic. Well, look what the X-ray machine can do, and so on. So back then we didn't have it, but as Dr. Peter Guy Manners, Dr. The astronaut, said, now we can do so much more, and so many of the people that are doing research, of course, have their credentials, but they have the knowledge and training. The definition in Webster's dictionary, if you look it up, says, is the belief that the dead survive as spirits which can communicate with the living, especially with the help of a third party called a medium. For those of you that may want to know more about history, it was at the Council of Nicaea, Nicea, and that was in the 4th century, when the belief, and this was the Catholic doctrine, that it was in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea that it was decided the priest could no longer marry. And at that time, the Greeks said, no, we're going to allow our priests to continue to marry. So, and that was the first split off of that first church. The belief in reincarnation was taken away. And even in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it says there is no death.
Right.
Everlasting life. You reap what you sow. Well, to have had a past life by self-experience, not ever believing in it, when I was in Wales, I happened to be in the same place I'd had a past life. And sometimes some of you may sense you know something, and it's because you may have known it before or sensed it before. But I know that I had a past life experience. I was not stoned. I was not on any kinds of drugs. I was actually with two people that taught at Cornell, and we were visiting a healer, a well-known healer in Wales. And we stopped at a place that I had done a dowsing on a map, because I was trained for dowsing. Because there are many things we can find with dowsing, not just water. And so I had done a dowsing of a map in Wales, and I wanted to go there. And I did have a past life experience there. And in fact, I'm just saying, sometimes you have to seek in order to find. Where did I hear that one from before?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, but I do believe in it. Because we've been with some of the same people before. I'm sure among you, you say, boy, I know that person, but I don't. Because we all have the same passport. We're all going to find out the truth. And the truth shall be made known unto you. As a believer in the reincarnation now, because for a very long time I didn't believe in it, but it really took having a past life experience to believe that you truly do reap what you sow. There's another expression, payback is a... Okay. But you know what, I'm going to tell you, it was the book by Helen Keller, who was both, not only both, she was deaf and, right? And blind and dumb. And what did she write? She was an avid believer. And what made her have to go through that to wake her up to that? So she was a strong believer. And if she can believe in it, I ought to give a little bit of credence. I'm just saying how I felt at the time. I want to tell you one little experience the first day I was at the Auburn prison, though, other than what I shared with you. The men that I met that day, I let them know that I was also into religious training, and that I was a believer. And they had also heard some things too. But anyway, as God is my witness, just before we had to leave the room, and there was a bell that said, okay, it's at the end of the program, we're going to be leaving the room, but I would go out first. There would be a guard. I lived at 66 House Street across from the warden's house. I still call them guards. But anyway, there was a correctional officer outside the door. And before he opened the door, and the men were standing right there all in a group because they were going to follow out after I was ushered out. I was telling the men as we were waiting, because the officer didn't open the door right away. As God is a witness, a little mouse showed up at my foot. Now, I don't know if any of the men carried a mouse in, but I said, there's a mouse. And maybe they thought I would get scared, but anyway. As God is a witness, I looked down at that mouse, and I said, are you here to hear a story? And that mouse stood up on its little back leg. And I said, and actually I repeated a story that I told the men in that room that day of why I believed. And I said, did you hear the story? And that little mouse's head went, And the men saw it. And then I said, with God, all things are possible. All right. I'm not done yet, but I just want to close that part of the paper. So I kind of touched on the importance of ley lines, and of course, the fact that you can go to Sonoma and really be bombarded. And it's kind of interesting that that huge mound being man-made, that those several ley lines would go through that mound. And if I hadn't been given an indication from what I learned out in New Mexico from a shaman who was teaching me about ley lines, and I actually have an interesting looking, like, it looks like a ray gun, but it has an antenna that I can use basically for finding what I'm looking to find. Maybe a spirit or whatever. I'm into this stuff. Anyway, and then discovering about the ley lines here at Auburn. And the fact that we're really, and I've only recently started to write about ley lines, and a couple of you may have seen my article, but the editor won't let me do any more writing on ley lines. So that's okay, it's his prerogative, but the former editor, and I know his name so well, and he let me do my parapsychology stuff. But anyway, I just am glad you've let me talk a little bit about ley lines. Are we alone now? We are not alone in this room. And I know that your loved ones, especially because from time to time they're going to come in, because they'll be there for a special anniversary sometimes, the birth of a grandchild, et cetera, because it's just the way it is. I mean, and then you'll find out eventually, and then that's the way it is.